Greetings to everyone. I welcome you all to AI Ethics in Africa Colloquium. I hope you all can hear me. Please, if you can, okay. Thank you very much for letting me know that you can hear me clearly. So once again, welcome to AI Ethics in Africa Colloquium. So the aim of this colloquium is to contribute to the ethics of artificial intelligence from the African context. So we have great lineup of speakers. We have 8 of them. So what we will do, this is how this program will run. We will take 2 speakers, then we'll take the Q&A. Then we'll take another 2 and the Q&A. That is how the lecture will flow. So please, I want to plead with us to stick to time. Each speaker has 15 minutes for his or her lecture. Please kindly mute yourself as you join the event. And also during Q&A, try to keep your questions or contributions or comments very brief. So before I call the first speaker, I would love to acknowledge my host, my postdoc host, Professor Abraham Olivier, who is the director of the Center for Phenomenology in South Africa. I would also want to acknowledge the Conversational School of Philosophy for collaborating with me on this event. So my name is Amara Esther Chimakunam. I'm a postdoc at the Center for Phenomenology in South Africa, University of Fort Hare. I'm the organizer of this event, and I will also be your moderator for today. So Professor Catherine Botha is a professor at the Department of Philosophy, University of Johannesburg. She will be speaking to us on AI ethics in or for Africa, a call for an interrogation of the indigenous principle perspective. Please, Professor Botha, you can talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really delighted to be joining this really important event. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I am sharing my screen on my side. Amara, I wonder if you could just confirm to me that my screen is, no, you can see it from your side?
Yes, very clear.
Wonderful, wonderful. So once again, thank you very much for inviting me to join this very special event. I'm delighted to be here. It's wonderful to be spending time with such a wonderful lineup of experts. Thank you so much to the organizers, and especially to the University of Fort Hare. So without any further ado, let me begin with my presentation. So UNESCO tells us that global AI ethics initiatives should frame Africa as a cross-cutting concern. But the question is, what exactly could that mean, and how could that be of significance? Well, what I'm going to do for you today is something that's really undergirded by that concern, but remains still a work in progress. So this is a big project that I'm doing, and the 2 papers that are of significance to what I'm doing here today are, of course, ones that focus on how to tease out how the indigenous principle perspective appears in the literature. So that's the first paper in this series that I'm writing. And of course, the one that I'm going to present to you today has already been accepted for publication and should appear by the end of this year or early next year. So that's what I'm going to do with you today. Just so that you know, it comes together with a sister paper. And of course, the sister paper, which is currently under review, is one that explores African aesthetic values in approaches to AI ethics. And that is, of course, what I propose is a very worthwhile and important supplement to the current work that's being done in the context of Indigenous principles. So you might say, well, why is this interesting? Well, there hasn't really been a review, as far as I can see anyway, on the kinds of papers that use the Indigenous principle perspective. And I think it's significant because if we do the kind of review that I'm proposing, well, we can reveal challenges and opportunities in our efforts to develop an AI ethics in or for Africa. So that's really just to tell you where I'm going and how this is going to fit in. I know I've only got 15 minutes, so I'm going to move reasonably rapidly through the paper. Okay, so in the last decade, there's been a huge proliferation of literature in the area of AI ethics. I mean, those of you who teach AI ethics, it's almost impossible to put together a course anymore because there's just so much literature. And of course, within that proliferation, there's been a massive amount of writing that's been published on AI ethics, specifically in or for Africa. Now, from my reading of the literature, and this is the review that I did, and you need to tell me if I've done it well, I think it's reasonable to assert that there are two groups of papers, two groups of literature, groupings of literature, when we're looking at AI ethics in or for Africa. So according to me anyway, on the one hand, we've got theorists who focus on discussing the role of concepts like Ubuntu and its cognates in AI ethics. And of course, there on the left-hand side of your screen, I've given you a very short list of some of the theorists. Some of them are my own students or my past students who have done this kind of work. And these kinds of approaches I'm going to call the Indigenous principle approaches. This is following Buisu Ani. Just in case it's not familiar to you, in his discussion of conflict resolution in Africa, Ani distinguishes between three schools of thought when he writes on African solutions to African problems. And he calls these schools of thought agency perspectives, Indigenous perspectives, and innovative perspectives. And of course, within the Indigenous school of thought, Ani says the Indigenous principle perspective is one variant. So as Ani explains it, from an Indigenous principles perspective, rather than examining practices in Africa that are used to approach a particular issue, the focus is rather on guiding principles, ideas, or outlooks that highlight the commonalities in Africa without undermining the particularities in various localities in the continent. Okay, so from Ani's perspective, then there's this strong recognition that Africa is not a country, but rather a continent that has an immensely rich diversity. And despite this diversity, there are commonalities that allow us to use the word African to describe these principles or these ideas or these outlooks. And of course, I've given you some examples of these principles or ideas. The three that I've given to you there are three that generally point towards the idea of I am because we are, this idea of community and the value of communal relationships in African systems. Okay, so that's the Indigenous principle approaches. And this is, of course, my summary of the kind of literature that I've looked at. Now, on the other hand, there are other approaches, which I'm going to call techno-colonization, or maybe just colonization, decolonization approaches. And I've given you some examples of theorists who work here, Ritcombe Bloom, and so on. These kinds of papers, contributions, books are, in my opinion, broadly focused on issues of justice. So really looking at addressing the absence of African voices in shaping the future of AI development, resource exploitation. Some of my students are working on that, and epistemic and other injustices. Now, there is admittedly some overlap between these two broad groupings that I've identified, but I think this split that I think is evident in the literature is premised on two different impulses, and that's at the bottom of your screen there. So the indigenous principle perspective literature can, I think, be premised on what I'm going to call the desire to develop or to construct the positive assertion that AI ethics in and or for Africa should engage with cultural diversity and explore what AI ethics and robot ethics means in specific cultural contexts. Okay. The second grouping is underlined by, in my opinion anyway, a desire to unravel or address, and here I want to use this word, deconstruct, the idea that AI strategies are often dominated by powerful global actors, and that the structural problems that we see need to be addressed. So in my reading then of the literature, the two impulses, construction and deconstruction, then underlie the two approaches that I've identified in the literature that we find. And of course, my interest in today's paper is going to be focused mostly or solely really on the constructive side of things, on the indigenous principle approach. So what is my argument? I can't give you the whole argument because I've got very little time, but my argument is really this. There's been a steady increase in the number of global and regional AI ethics initiatives. We see them. And of course, Jobin et al., who I'm quoting here, tells us that these are really focused. If we look at the kinds of AI ethics initiatives that we see today, these are really focused around 5 ethical principles, and they're familiar to all of you: transparency, justice and fairness, non-maleficence, responsibility, and privacy. Now, nevertheless, Jobin et al. Report a substantive divergence in relation to how these principles are interpreted, why they're deemed important, what issue, domain, or actors they pertain to, and how they should be implemented. So the question then is, despite these claims of universality, most AI ethics principles and their guidelines are developed by stakeholders based in economically developed and so-called Western countries like the United States or the European Union. So it seems that some aspects of the principles might not automatically or easily apply in Africa without some adjustments. One example here is the principle for respect for autonomy. It may be seen as incompatible in some of its iterations with the African communitarian approach to decision-making. And of course, then, how do we find common ground here? Okay, well, a common ground can be found if we base our decision-making on the idea of personhood in African traditions, where a relational and positive sense of autonomy, which involves the community guiding one to use one's ability and one's knowledge to develop a life plan. So there are ways in which this is being done. Now, what am I going to say? Well, what I argue for in the paper is to say that despite the usefulness of indigenous principle approaches, such as those focused on Ubuntu in South Africa, they are, in my opinion, currently limited in their usefulness, some of them anyway, to the development of an AI ethics in or for Africa. Why? First of all, they make vague appeals to how an indigenous principle can be used and nothing more. So we find that in a number of papers. I'm not going to talk about them here in any detail. Or they appeal to an indigenous principle such as Ubuntu, but they neglect to show how that principle can be used to supplement or interpret codes of ethics that are currently in use. So they don't show us how, for example, Ubuntu can make the 5 ethical principles that Jobin points out, for example, more effective. Or C, they appeal to an indigenous principle, but they fail to show how it can be used to develop new or more fruitful codes of ethics, so very close there. or they show only how the interpretation of an indigenous principle can be applied to a particular case or set of cases. So that's the first line of argument that I make, and I go into detail about the kinds of works that do that. Secondly, and this is the second way in which I criticize the literature, I say that these indigenous principle approaches, some of them reinforce a neglect of other rich traditions in African thinking. And of course, for me, what's important, and this is the second paper that I'm not going to talk about today, aesthetic values are of particular importance here, because in my opinion, they are intimately intertwined with the ethical. And so there should be, and this is what I do in the second paper, a focus on how we can reject the kind of focus that we have on oculocentrism for a different African approach, which focuses on listening, on storytelling, on oration. And that, of course, will then change the way in which we look at ethics. So this quote by Rampele that's become quite famous is, of course, for me, particularly strong. That is not where I'm going. The point that I'm trying to make is that questions in AI ethics and the development of AI codes of ethics could benefit from a shift of focus. So you might be saying, well, why should we care? Well, we should care because the ethics charters we adopt guide the development and deployment of AI, and so have the power to alter the way in which we respond to issues like bias, exclusion, and so on. And in addition, the way in which we interpret our ethics charters is also important. Ethics charters may, for example, be developed with a sensitivity to injustice and balancing relational approaches with autonomy, for example. But if there's no sensitivity to the way in which those charters are interpreted, then the desired consequences of a universal AI ethical principle, set of principles, may not be achieved. And so, of course, we need to, in my opinion, explore the richness of our African intellectual tradition in a way that's not one-dimensional. So what I do later in the paper is I look at how Ubuntu has been used. I point out 3 ways in which it is used in a positive sense. And of course, I point out some examples of papers. I've just put 2 here. There are more, where the authors make it clear exactly how an indigenous approach can, like Ubuntu, can be used to drive an agenda in terms of developing an ethics. So where do I go? Well, here's my conclusion. I'm not calling for the jettisoning of indigenous principle approaches. So that's really important for you to remember. What I do think is that a cognizance of the limitations of current, or some of the current indigenous principle perspectives in the literature does not mean that we need to throw away these principles. What I do think it means is that there needs to be a call for the theorists working in the area of AI ethics to be more critical of approaches where the concepts are used as mere fashionable placeholders that just have no teeth. In addition, and this is what I do in my second sister paper, is that I want to call for theorists to widen our approach, to not focus just on these principles, but rather to widen the approach away from an almost exclusive focus on concepts like Ubuntu, neglecting the very rich tradition of the interlinkage, and this is my idea, of ethical and aesthetic values. I think this can be drawn upon very fruitfully in addressing questions in AI ethics and in the development and implementation of ethics charters. Drawing attention to the one-dimensionality that seems to be in evidence in many of these approaches seems to me to strengthen our efforts to devise an AI ethics that can address the challenges that we face in Africa today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Professor Botha. You stopped right on time. Thank you for your thoughts-provoking lecture.